At this year's Combine, Shamar Stewart made a big jump up the draft board.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, where right now new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. And if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong. And I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we're going to hear from what the various NFL insiders weighed in on Kirk Cousins' fate and sort of a new wrinkle in terms of how things could play out in the Kirk Cousins saga. We'll get some more insight into some of the character concerns for pass rushers like Marshall's Mike Green and Tennessee's James Pierce Jr., heading into the coming out of the combine, and whether or not that's going to take them off the board for the Falcons in round 1. But it is a mock draft Monday, and we are looking at a mock draft from this past week from Yahoo Sports, our good friend Charles McDonald, as well as Nate Tice, mocking Shamar Stewart, the edge rusher from Texas A&M, to the Atlanta Falcons at pick 15. And one wonders if Charles and Nate had waited a couple of days before putting out that mock, maybe they wouldn't have had Shamar Stewart still on the board at 15, because it seems like Shamar Stewart is rising up the board. Now, I looked at 11 mock drafts over the last week to sort of look at where Shamar Stewart's average draft position in comparison to some of the other edge rushers that have often been in the mix for the Falcons at pick 15, Jalen Walker and Mikael Williams of Georgia, Mike Green as well. And their average draft position, Stewart was the lowest at 19, Green was 14, Williams was 13, and Walker was 12. And I also looked at how many of those 11 mock drafts that had each of those guys on the board still at 15 for the Falcons to pick. Walker and Williams were only on the board at 15 for 5 of those 11 mock drafts. Green was 6, and Stewart was 10 out of those 11 from this past week. The one exception was the one mock that I looked at out of this 11 mock sample that came out on Friday after Shamar Stewart tested on Thursday. And I wonder if we replay this exercise a week from now on the next mock draft Monday, a week from now, will we sort of see how these rankings adjust on their average draft position and how many of these guys are still on the board at pick 15 for the Falcons to choose from. And so Stewart is a player that really helped himself at this year's combine. And I don't know if I said this on a previous episode of the podcast. I know I've said it to the Locked On Falcons Insiders. I know I talked about it with Jarvis Davis off air. I don't recall if I said anything on air, but basically he was a player that I thought going at the beginning of this process, when I started scouting Stewart ahead of the Senior Bowl back in early January, that he was a guy that was likely to rise during this draft process, because we've seen players similar to Shamar Stewart with the sort of the traits and the physical tools rise up this draft boards. Trayvon Walker is a great example of that, a guy that at the beginning of January was being mocked in the later part of round 1, wound up being the number 1 overall pick. Tyree Wilson was consistently mocked in the top 10, 15 picks in his draft in 2023, wound up being the number 7 overall pick. And it's that idea that we talked with Jarvis the other day about, coaches will always fall in love with the traits, right? And they basically, we'll coach up the rest of it. We can't coach up the traits. And that's where Shamar Stewart shined, as we thought he would. We talked about him going into the week where we thought he would test really well, but he measured in 6'5", 267. That's down 14 pounds from what his Senior Bowl weigh-in, seemingly dropping that weight to run fast. He ran a 4.59 40, which is a very good 40, but not necessarily elite when you adjust it for his weight, right? That's a 120 speed score, which is that weight adjusted 40 time, which is, if you compare him to all the other first round edges that have been drafted since 2010 and in round one, that's like 80th percentile. So very good, but not necessarily like historically good. So it's comparable to what Marcus Davenport and Lucas Van Ness, their weight adjusted 40s are. But it really where Stewart shined was in the jumps, right? Where he proves that explosive capability, 40-inch vertical, which is 96th percentile among all edge rushers, but is fifth best among all round one edges since 2010. So that would be 93rd percentile just among first round picks in terms of that vertical jump. A 131-inch broad jump or a 10-foot 11-inch broad jump, which is again 98th percentile among all edge rushers, but would be 93rd percentile, fifth best among edge rushers taken in round one since 2010. And it's very impressive to do that at 267 pounds, because when you look at a lot of the guys that have those 38, 39, 40 plus inch verticals that were taken in round one, as well as the broad jumps that are approaching, 10, 11, almost 11 feet or more, most of those guys were sub 260 pounds, right? The only two that were above 260 pounds, like Shamar Stewart, were Bud Dupree, who had a 42-inch vertical and a 11.6 broad jump, 138, at 269 pounds back in that 2015 draft, and Myles Garrett, who had a 41-inch vertical, a 128 broad jump or 10.8 broad at 272 pounds in that 2017 draft. So Shamar Stewart is in unique air when it comes to how explosive he is with those jumps, and that is reflected on his film with how explosive a player he is. And so for that reason, I look at these numbers and say, yeah, man, these are great numbers. But as we discussed a couple of days ago on the podcast, kind of thought Shamar Stewart would have a very impressive numbers. It's just whether or not he would put up historic numbers in terms of that. So to me, this is more of checking a box than necessarily a guy that, at least in my eyes, it's moving the needle in terms of his draft stock, because we knew that he would have some impressive jumps and show that explosiveness. Now, the big red flag with Shamar Stewart is the lack of sack production he had at Texas A&M for the last 3 years, 1.5 sacks in each of the last 3 seasons. The question to me I have is maybe this is a Texas A&M thing rather than a specific Shamar Stewart thing, because this has kind of been a through line with Texas A&M these last couple of years where guys have left the program. Fidel Diggs, who's in this draft class, along with Walter Nolan at Syracuse and Ole Miss, respectively, were both at Texas A&M in previous years, transferred to new schools, were much more productive at their new schools, right? We saw Nick Scorton, Shamar Stewart's teammate this past year, led the Big Ten in sacks at Purdue in 2023 with 10 sacks, and then that production was halved this past year at Texas A&M. And you go back to some other guys, like Texas A&M has not been producing prolific sack artists, even though they've been regularly churning in pass rushers into the NFL over the last 5 or 6 years. So that's part of the investigation when you do your due diligence, where I don't know if the sack numbers are nearly as bad for Shamar Stewart as they maybe look at face value. That, basically the idea is like, if he went to another school, he'd probably get 4 or 5 sacks, which is much better than 1.5 sacks. But, I think with Stewart, given the pass rush production, despite how much blame you want to put on Texas A&M and how they play defense, I don't think you can expect him to project well to the next level in terms of being a guy that's going to get a bunch of sack production there. Like, I think his skill set projects well to be more of a pressure guy, right? And like, he had a lot of production as a pressure guy. A 12 win rate this past year, I think it was like 14 something the previous year, which is better than some other of these guys in the SEC, like Landon Jackson and Mikael Williams. But I think you're going to the next level thinking you're projecting Shamar Stewart to have a similar production profile as, say, a Jadeveon Clowney, who is a guy that is a productive pressure guy, but does not get a ton of sacks, mostly because Clowney doesn't necessarily have that elite bend. I think Stewart is probably a better athlete in terms of the bend there. He didn't test in the agilities, so we'll see if he does that at the pro day. But I think when you talk about, we talked about this a ton on the podcast over the years, going back to even Takk McKinley in 2017, talked about it last year with Jared Verse, where it's like these guys that are power rushers first, and that's Shamar Stewart's game, is being a power rusher. Those guys typically do not get a ton of sacks. They get a ton of pressure. We talked about this a week or so ago with Jared Verse, where Jared Verse, you look at his pressure production, getting 75 plus pressures, right? That typically translates to about 12 or 13 sacks. But he only had 4.5 sacks last year. And so to me, Stewart is one of those guys that in that sort of Clowney role, in that Verse role, Takk McKinley, et cetera, you may not necessarily be looking at this guy getting a ton of sacks. He might only be like a 5 or 6 sack guy, right? That's been what Clowney has kind of been throughout his career, but you can consistently rely on him getting 50, 60 pressures most years. And I think that's kind of what you're hoping for Shamar Stewart. And again, that may be a little disappointing at the number 1 overall pick, like it was with Jadeveon Clowney, where a lot of people thought he would be this like perennial double digit sack guy. But at pick 15, right, I think that's a little bit easier of a pill to swallow for a team like Atlanta, who's just, at that point going to get the best player that they could possibly get at that point in time. And so I think the thing with Stewart is like what you like about Stewart is similar to Verse. I'm not suggesting that he's going to have defensive rookie of the year type of season that Jared Verse have, but he's a guy that I think that power translates. You saw it against Will Campbell at LSU. You saw it with a number of offensive tackles. You saw it at the Senior Bowl. We talked about this during Senior Bowl week where Stewart came in a little slow on day 1, and then day 2 was like, you know what? I'm just going to go back to my tried and true power, and I'm just going to bully guys. And he absolutely annihilated guys all day long to the point that he pulled out of the Senior Bowl after that sort of day 2. And so I think if you're drafting Shamar Stewart, if you're the Atlanta Falcons, you're drafting a guy to come in day 1, be that bully, and then hope that you can develop the other skill sets. And he's a young player, going to be 21 or so. And again, let's blame Texas A&M and just put it all on. They just are not developing their guys to the degree that they need to. And where Shamar Stewart could be in years 2 and 3, if the Falcons can successfully develop him beyond just being that bully and can develop the hands and develop the pass rush moves, I think you could be looking at a player that could be more than Jadeveon Clowney, could be Trayvon Walker, as we've seen Walker get double-digit sacks these past 2 years due to his development in Jacksonville. So that is something that you're looking for in Shamar Stewart. And especially if the Falcons are going to roll with a 4-3 front in 2025, now with new defensive coordinator Jeff Ulbrich, Shamar Stewart makes even more sense to play one of those edge spots. So we're talking about a player in Shamar Stewart who's raised his stock over the weekend at the Combine. Let's talk about a couple of guys that stocks may be going in the wrong direction in Mike Green and James Pierce Jr. as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So when the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on that action than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because with FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you missed that opening tip-off or you just want to bet on that fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a big payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. We love a same-game parlay where you can bet the over-under on Trae Young points, Dyson Daniels steals, rebounds, all that stuff and more. Who's going to be ahead at halftime? It's all available for you over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So we talked about this going into the week last week with Mike Green on the Mock Draft Monday, where we talked about his potential fit in Atlanta. And he did not wind up testing, which was a little disappointing because this, scouting combine environment was one that I thought Green could have a similar story of Shamar Stewart of really helping his stock. But last week we talked about sort of the off-field incident that led to his transferring from Virginia after his freshman year to Marshall. And we found out what that was over the week. We couldn't really speak on it last week because didn't know enough information. We got more information this past week where apparently it was due to a sexual assault allegation while he was at Virginia. Green has insisted in public statements to reporters when asked about it that he is innocent of what he was alleged to do, but he had another previous allegation in high school. And due to the zero tolerance policy that Virginia adopted when Green enrolled there, they suspended him and he was forced to transfer. And so this is troubling given the magnitude of such allegations. Again, I can't necessarily speak too much on that because I don't have enough info to go one way or the other. I generally tend to believe women, but I can't firmly say anything about it without more information. So it is a sensitive topic and issue that deserves more scrutiny and more than what it's going to get on today's episode. But because of that lack of information, I'm not going to necessarily speak on it. So we're going to approach the rest of this conversation purely from a football PR perspective, not in terms of the sort of moral issues and the criminal issues that are involved in this incident. So, it's going to take a team like the Falcons when it comes to Mike Green to do their due diligence, right? And we can talk about why you want to do that due diligence because of two examples that have occurred here in Atlanta, as well as in the past with another team, where they didn't quite do their homework before drafting a player, and then the player had to go away because of things that surfaced after the player was drafted. The most recent example of that is the punter Matt Ariza, who was drafted in round 6 by the Bills back in 2022. And then in August, rape allegations surfaced from his time at San Diego State. The Bills said that they didn't learn about these allegations until a month before they came out, so in July, as opposed to knowing them before he was drafted. So not doing your due diligence on that. They wound up cutting him the day after those allegations surfaced. Ariza would go through the legal process, sue his accuser. Both sides would drop that lawsuit in December of 2023. And then he would sign with the Kansas City Chiefs this past February in 2024, and then wound up playing his first season this past year in 2024. But essentially, because the Bills didn't do their due diligence, they wound up, Ariza had to go away for 18 months before he could get back on a football field due to this incident. And you go back to the situation in Atlanta where the Falcons took Prince Shimbo, a linebacker out of Notre Dame, with a 4th-round selection back in the 2014 draft. He was accused of sexual assault while in college. The girl that accused him of that wound up committing suicide later. So it was a very ugly incident there. The Falcons indicated they did their homework and due diligence on that. And after Shimbo's rookie season, he was arrested for animal cruelty. He wound up kicking his girlfriend's dog, who was a Yorkie, I think it was, after the dog bit him. And then the dog died when he assaulted that dog. And then the very next day, the Falcons wound up cutting him, and he wound up never playing another snap in the NFL. And so if you're a team like the Falcons, or really any team in the NFL, you don't want a similar situation to happen with Mike Green, where things come to light later on that make you have to force your hand to be like, oh, we need to move off of this guy, especially if that's a 1st-round pick. Is it going to be a similar situation like Ariza, where Mike Green has to go away because somewhere along the line, some journalist starts doing some digging that NFL teams weren't doing, writes some expose, more information comes to light, and then you're forced to either say, hey, we're rolling with this guy despite these nasty allegations, or we're going to have to wind up cutting him. And that's going to be much more of a serious issue than cutting a late-round punter or a mid-round off-ball linebacker when this guy is potentially your number 1 pick and the kind of the face of your draft class. And theoretically, if you're the Falcons, the face of your defense and your pass rush, hopefully for the next decade or more. And then come August, because someone, released more information because you didn't do your homework, he has to go away for a while. And so that's going to be the challenge, I think, when it comes to Mike Green, again, purely from a PR situation where teams are going to have to do their due diligence. And we know historically NFL teams don't necessarily do that, right? They'll talk to the player, they'll talk to the agent, right? They might read a police report, and then they're like, okay, we're good to go. They don't talk to the victims, right? This came up with the Deshaun Watson situation, where the lawyer that was representing all those civil suits against Deshaun Watson due to his sexual misconduct was like, I never got a phone call from any NFL teams to sort of clear Deshaun Watson in that book. And so we already seen a Falcons owner in Arthur Blank, when the Falcons were one of those teams that pursued Deshaun Watson without doing their due diligence, right? When they didn't land Deshaun Watson, we've seen the Falcons owner, Arthur Blank, basically be in pure denial mode, where he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. We didn't try to sign Deshaun Watson. And so that makes me very skeptical that the Falcons go down this road, that the Falcons will go down this road again with another player accused of some of the things that Mike Green has been accused of. That puts me skeptical to whether or not the Falcons, if Mike Green is on the board at pick 15, will they pull the trigger? We'll see what happens. But, that is going to be something to keep an eye on. So I sit here thinking, basically, guys, all that to say is I would be very skeptical of the idea that the Falcons are going to draft Mike Green in the 1st round. Okay. Now, when we talk about James Pierce Jr., it's not necessarily that type of off-field situation. It was more of his character concerns going into the week where due to locker room situation where basically the Tennessee coaching staff and Pierce did not get along, right? It speaks to the quote unquote coachability of James Pierce. And at least from the Tennessee coaches, they were giving him failing grades from what he did last year. And so that's going to lead to NFL teams basically being in one of 2 columns, one of 2 buckets, right? Column A is going to be those teams are going to listen to the Tennessee coaching staff and say, you know what? We're gonna ding this guy a little bit. We're gonna pass on this guy potentially, and then there's gonna be column B where they're gonna be like, well, he had these issues in college, but we believe in our locker room that we can overcome those issues at the next level. And so, if I'm guessing, again, purely a guess, but I would guess the Falcons would probably be more likely to be one of those column A teams, and that's going to knock James Pierce down their board because of those character issues. And I saw some rumors, not only could James Pierce fall out of round 1, but I saw some people speculating that these issues could cause him to fall completely out of round 2 in this upcoming draft. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on. So when we talk about these first round edges, we talk about Abdul Carter of Penn State, Jalen Walker and Michael Williams of Georgia, Mike Green of Marshall, James Pierce Jr. of Tennessee, and Shamar Stewart of Texas A&M, sort of the consensus 6 edges that are consistently mocked into the first round of the draft. If we know Carter's going to be long gone by the time the Falcons are off the board, and if we're crossing Mike Green and James Pierce off the Falcons list as potential options for them at pick 15, now you're basically down to just 3 guys that you're hoping, whether it's Walker, Williams, or Stewart, are there. And, at this rate, who knows if those guys are going to be there. So, and I would even argue, again, we won't talk about it on today's episode, but I would argue that maybe even Jalen Walker shouldn't necessarily be in the mix for the Falcons at 15, not because of any character issues. I want to make that clear, but just simply because of sort of that tweenerness of his sort of positional flexibility, making him perceived to be versatile, but there's a potential red flag when it comes to that thing. But we won't get into that on today's episode. That will probably be something that we'll say for a future mock draft Monday. But, this, because you might have more limited options at 15 in terms of the Falcons taking a round 1 edge, obviously that opens up the door for conversation for the Falcons to go for another defensive position player in round 1. But also, I think this may push the Falcons, hopefully, to be more aggressive in March, filling some of those edge rusher needs, just because even though this is a deep class and you still should be able to get a good edge rusher, if not in round 1, but on day 2 of the draft, but because you're not going to get that sort of signature guy in round 1 that you can say, hey, this is our guy for the next decade or more, maybe you need to go out and get that guy in free agency. So that is going to be an ongoing topic of conversation, and I'm sure we will dive more deeply into that as the week wears on. But we'll wrap up today's episode talking about the buzz surrounding Kirk Cousins, and we got some very interesting tidbits that is causing me to reassess, whether or not the last 2.5 months, as I've been telling you, they're definitely cutting Kirk, right? Maybe they won't be doing it. So let's get into all of that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So as I said, going into the combine, we were waiting to see what some of the various NFL insiders and rumor mongers were going to say about the Falcons and the Kirk Cousins situation. And we got some of that over the last couple of days. First from Dan Graziano and Jeremy Fowler of ESPN. Both of them indicated that the Falcons are expected to likely cut Kirk Cousins, but not everybody that they talk to think that is a definite outcome, as we have been suggesting for the better part of 3 months here on this podcast. You also have Tony Pauline of Sportskeeda, who cites sources close to Kirk Cousins that say that he suggests that Kirk could stay on a renegotiated deal here in Atlanta. Now, no offense to Tony Pauline, who's done this for a very long time, but he also around this time was saying that the Falcons and Bears were finalizing a trade for Justin Fields at this exact moment last year at the Combine. So, we'll put a little bit less stock in Tony Pauline's statements. So the idea of Kirk restructuring and sticking as a backup, to me, seems, of the things that we're going to be talking about today, the least plausible of the potential outcomes. But I think the more interesting thing came from Ben Valin of the Boston Globe, where he talked about, the Falcons' statements of keeping Kirk Cousins, which we've talked about a bunch on this podcast over the last 2+ months, which is purely to drum up interest in the trade market. And Ben Valin put that forward as a possibility, which is the sort of assumed thing. But he also offered an alternative reason why the Falcons are talking about keeping Kirk Cousins, because it's the goal of pressuring Kirk Cousins to take a pay cut before they wind up releasing him. It's the idea of the Falcons are going to play hardball with Kirk Cousins and threaten to squat on Kirk Cousins all year long unless he takes a pay cut, so he won't necessarily get out to market and be able to leave Atlanta. And so we've talked before many times on this podcast over the last 2+ months about Kirk Cousins having all the leverage when it comes to this due to that having that no trade clause. And it appears that the leverage that the Falcons are trying to pull is basically, this one little tidbit of leverage that the Falcons do have in this situation is basically go to Kirk and say, hey, Kirk, if you want to get out here in early March, or early March, I'm sorry, when teams are going to be throwing out their money for new starting quarterbacks. Let's have a conversation about that, Kirk. You scratch my back, we'll scratch your back, sort of situation. Let's make your contract either more tradable by renegotiating that $27.5 million base salary down, which is fully guaranteed this year. And again, the off speculation is that that's going to be a very, very, very hard contract to trade. And it's going to be even harder to trade if the Falcons wait till after March 17th, because the new team that would be taking on Kirk Cousins would be taking on basically $37.5 million, $27.5 guaranteed base salary this year, and then a $10 million roster bonus that becomes fully guaranteed on March 17th next year. And so if you can't trade Kirk for $27.5 million, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to trade Kirk for $37.5 million. But it's the idea of, again, Kirk, let's play ball here, and let's make it easier for us to cut you by renegotiating this base salary and potentially restructuring it down, and you essentially waiving some of that guaranteed money that you're owed this year, and then go out there in the open market and get that guaranteed. And we, of course, as we've discussed, Kirk Cousins and his representation should absolutely be wanting to get out and make this release happen so that they can get out in the open market and be able to have their leverage when it comes to negotiating whatever Kirk's situation is. The more suitors you have, and that's not the case when a trade conversation is. So, we were assuming that the Falcons, when they were saying that they were keeping Kirk, it was purely for trade negotiation. And now it seems like, the idea of, this is part of their negotiation with other teams. But now it seems like, based off of some of these reports, particularly from Ben Volin, is that maybe it's part of a negotiating with Kirk, where they're saying this as a part of their negotiating with Kirk. It's like, Kirk, you don't want to be here. We don't want you here. So let's come together and figure this thing out. And so that's a situation where maybe everybody can win in this situation. And that goes to the thing I've been saying for 2+ months, which is like, well, the Falcons already, they can't win in this situation. They've already taken the L. And so trying to turn the L into a win is basically a waste of time. So just cut Kirk Cousins and move on. And this sort of game of chicken that they're playing that they can't realistically win, because you don't necessarily want to deal with the baggage of having Kirk Cousins still on this roster come April, May, June, when you get to OTAs and whatnot. Nobody wants that. Kirk Cousins doesn't want that. And I don't think the Falcons want that. And so, like, you already dealt with a quarterback controversy in 2024. There's no reason to carry that over into 2025. You want to leave that in 2024. And so with the guaranteed money that Kirk is owed, the $27.5 million, he gets that money regardless of what team he's on. If you trade him, you get another team to pay that money to him. And again, getting another team to agree to that seems like a very slim possibility, but we'll see how it all plays out. But if you cut Kirk Cousins with that $27.5 million guaranteed, he still gets paid that money. And the question to me was like, okay, well, why would Kirk give that up, right? If you're Kirk Cousins and his representation, call the Falcons bluff, see if they're going to keep you past March 16th. All right. And now you even owe me, instead of $27.5 million you owe me $37.5 million. So we'll see how it all plays out, guys, right? If there is an incentive for Kirk and his representation to play ball now, if this is what the Falcons are going to do, if they're going to basically say, hey, Kirk, we're not going to cut you unless you do us a solid, right? If you want to leave Atlanta sooner versus later, and capitalize on this quarterback market where no longer Matt Stafford is out there available, teams seemingly reluctant for Aaron Rodgers, play ball with us. So we'll see if Kirk and company can do that. There's 2 weeks basically between now and that March 17th deadline. So, the Falcons need to make a decision on Kirk Cousins by March 16th, presumably, if they want to, get this situation resolved sooner versus later. So, maybe this is why we haven't heard that Kirk Cousins is being allowed to talk to other teams via trade, because the Falcons are trying to negotiate this situation first to see what goes on that. So I've been assuming it's going to go clearly in one direction. I've been saying it on this podcast for 2+ months. It's going to go this way, guys. No doubt about it. We're going to sit here and speculate about all the different things, but it's definitely going to end up this way. And it's like, this is the first time it's like, okay, this is really now potentially a different way. Again, still the outcome is probably Kirk gets cut, but it's a different outcome in the sense of the Falcons may not necessarily have to take all that dead money if they can negotiate that salary down, that instead of taking on, the $40 million in dead money this year, they can take on whatever. Again, we'll do the math at a later date. I'm trying to do it right off the top of my head. Probably should have done it before I jumped on the podcast, but it still feels very likely that Kirk is going to be cut, but the circumstances in which he'll be cut may be very different than what we saw. And maybe the Falcons will be able to cut him basically after negotiating down his base salary or something like that. So either way, however it resolves, we got tremendous content coming your way for the next 2 weeks. When it comes to Kirk Cousins, we got tremendous content coming your way here on Locked On Falcons. When it comes to all things Falcons, tomorrow, some of that tremendous content. We've been giving Zach Robinson grief for the last 2.5 months on this very podcast, and we're going to turn the page on that as well, right? We're going to talk about all the different ways that Falcons offensive coordinator Zach Robinson, along with Michael Penix and possibly even Kyle Pitts, if they're all going to lead this team to glory in 2025. So that's something that we can touch upon on tomorrow's episode. And so we'll also talk about some of the upcoming moves that the Falcons could be making in free agencies should they choose to be aggressive in March as well. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts in order to continue to make us your first listen as everydayers. And of course, if you want to get in on that second listen, make sure you check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast with Damian Parson, Keith Sanchez, giving the lowdown on sort of who shined and who didn't at this year's combine. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.